Welcome, dear guests, here at the Vienna School of International Studies, and warm welcome as well to everyone who is joining us online. My name is Marlies Eder. I am a journalist on the foreign desk of the Presse, focusing on China and Taiwan, and I am delighted to guide you through this evening. Today, we are going to take a closer look at a region that is quite complex, a region that plays a crucial role in the current geopolitical and economic landscape, a region that often feels distant and might therefore get limited public attention, at least in Europe and in Austria. But it is also a region that, whose interests are intertwined with those of Europe and those of the European Union. I'm talking about the Indo-Pacific and Southeast Asia. And before we start, I would like to give some organizational notes. So there will be a Q&A session after the presentations. And we invite everyone, also everyone who is joining us online, to take part in the discussion. But first of all, now I would like to give the floor to Michael Zinkanell, Director of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy.
Thank you very much, Marlies Eder, for moderating this discussion. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it's a pleasure to welcome you all this evening to this very timely discussion on Europe and Southeast Asia, anchors for a stable Indo-Pacific order. And this is a expression that has no question mark, as you probably know if you have attended former events that we organize here. Some of our titles bear question marks, but we very dearly and very strongly believe that the European Union and Southeast Asia are indeed actors and anchors for a stable Indo-Pacific order. I think the relevance cannot be highlighted enough of this discussion. The Indo-Pacific region and especially Southeast Asia are, of course, important regions for European security and European stability, economically vibrant and geopolitical complex regions, and certainly also this region, Southeast Asia, faces a broad array of different complex security threats as well. I would like to point out probably one element that was mentioned by the opening statement of the European Council's President Antonio Costa at the 47th ASEAN Summit in Kuala Lumpur this year, where he mentioned certain priorities looking ahead for the 50th anniversary of the ASEAN-EU relations that we will celebrate in 2027, in 3 years. And in preparing already the ground for this 50th anniversary, he mentioned that there are certain elements that are essential for a deepening of the partnership of the EU and the ASEAN region, amongst others addressing shared challenges such as climate change, exploring new areas for cooperation such as security, but also digitalization, and upgrading this partnership to a comprehensive strategic partnership by 2027. And I think these elements are already outlining the importance of the relationship, but certainly also the challenges that come with enhancing the partnership. And therefore, I'm very happy and very glad to announce that we will have a wonderful panel discussion to address these topics and also formulate concrete recommendations for the European Union, for European stakeholders, to basically be able to meet these demands that were outlined in this speech. I'm thankful to the Diplomatic Academy, to the Vienna School of International Studies for hosting us here today, but also for the Central European Institute for ASEAN Studies, who is a partner of this event and also a strategic partner for us at the AIES. Thank you very much to Alfred Gerstl in particular for also organizing and co-hosting this event together with us, and to the EUVIP project, a Horizon project that Alfred will be elaborating a little bit, because this event is also a dissemination activity and outreach activity of communicating the very relevant results of that EU project, EU in the Volatile Indo-Pacific project. So we're happy also to collaborate in that regard. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to a very interesting and timely discussion, and I hand over back to you, Marlies. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael, for the opening remarks. It's my pleasure now to invite Louis Simon to deliver the keynote speech. Simon is director of the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy at the VUB Brussels University. He is also director of the Brussels office of the Elcano Royal Institute, a think tank based in Madrid. And he is a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. His areas of expertise include international security, US foreign and defense policy, European security, and Asian security. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you. You can hear me, right? Yes. Thank you very much, and good evening, and thanks to AIES and of course to the EUVIP partners for the very kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. So I want to offer some thoughts on Europe's place in US-China competition, which I believe is a key question if we are to understand Europe's approach to the Indo-Pacific more broadly, as well as, of course, Southeast Asia. And I'm going to build on a special issue on Europe and US-China rivalry that I just published with some colleagues with the Journal of European Integration. Now, of course, as you know, the United States and China are engaged in a long-term strategic competition across the board, in the sense that that competition trickles through every region in the world, but also spans the military, economic, technological, ideological, and virtually every other domain. But these are the means. Ultimately, the United States and China are competing for power. And there might be some space for cooperation, but that doesn't cancel out the competition. The competition is structural, and it is the main structuring factor in international politics, in the sense that almost nothing today is immune, including the Ukraine war, by the way. Almost nothing is immune from that process. That doesn't mean that US-China competition defines everything or monopolizes everything. It doesn't. But there's hardly anything out there in terms of international politics today that is not touched significantly by US-China competition. Now, as US-China competition continues to intensify, and it has been intensifying for the past 5 years at least, these two powers are also ramping up their efforts to bring other states or international institutions, if we talk about the EU, on side, or to deny them to the other side. So the question of how to grapple with US and Chinese expectations, even pressures to take sides or not to take sides, has therefore become central for virtually any actor in the international system. Now, of course, these days, international relations scholars are typically challenging this notion that secondary states can either balance with the established great power, i.e. the United States, or bandwagon with the rising great power, meaning China. So there's a lot of hype around concepts like hedging or fence sitting, which technically allow secondary states to maintain close links with both the United States and China. And of course, there are factors like size, threat perception, geographical location, that no doubt inform secondary state alignment choices in great power competition. So for instance, you have a country like Japan, who has responded to China's growth and rise and militarization by both strengthening its own capabilities, including military capabilities, as well as reinforcing its alliance with the United States. So you have countries like Japan who are clearly balancing, right? Balancing with the United States and balancing against China. However, to go back to the title of this event, a majority of secondary states in Southeast Asia seem to be hedging. And they seem to be hedging out of uncertainty about Washington's willingness or ability to check China's rise and revisionism. They're either hedging out of expectations of profiting economically from China's rise, or some combination of the two, uncertainty about the US and wanting to profit from China's rise. And then you've got a number of powers, which I would call second-tier powers, and I would include there countries like India and Russia, but also the European Union, perhaps also Brazil, that seem to reject this frame of US-China competition because it allegedly imposes a binary choice on them. And they reject that as an organizing principle for their foreign policy and foreign economic policy, and instead seek to affirm their autonomy and set their own path. So with that as a sort of backdrop, what is Europe's place in US-China competition? Now, I would argue that Europe is both a player and a playground in US-China competition, and it's those two things simultaneously, actually. Because of its economic, technological, and diplomatic weight, Europe is an important playground. It's an important prize for the US and China. However, on the other hand, Europe is one of the few regions/actors, because Europe is, again, both a region and an actor simultaneously, that aspire to preserve a significant degree of autonomy from those two great powers. So, in other words, Europe can be a player as well. Now, the United States and China, as I was saying, realize that Europe can have an impact, a systemic impact on the balance of power, and have therefore tried and are trying to influence European policies in different areas, ranging from trade and investment to technology transfers and digital infrastructure to human rights and territorial disputes in the Indo-Pacific and in Southeast Asia. And they're doing that in very different ways because, of course, the nature of the relationship that the United States and China have with Europe is very different, right? The United States has an alliance with most European countries. It has deep and long-standing economic, political, and cultural ties, and is actually perceived, even today, by many European countries as an insider, as part of the family, not as an external power. In fact, if you go to some capitals, particularly in Eastern Northern Europe, sometimes they will feel that Washington is closer to them politically than even Brussels, right? And then China's ties, in contrast, are to Europe, that is, are non-existent when it comes to the security domain, rather moderate politically, and increasingly relevant economically, but not as deep as those with the United States that span finance, trade, goods, services, joint ventures. The economic relationship with China is mostly about trade in goods, right? So that means that the point of departure, or the success bar, if you will, that China and the United States have when it comes to Europe is very different, right? China's aim seems to be de-alignment, namely to get Europeans to reject this framework of US-China competition. So China, I would say, is not naive about its possibilities to either erode Europe's ties with the United States or match US influence in Europe. It simply wants to ensure that the transatlantic alliance is defined as narrowly as possible, that is confined to the European region and that is confined to security and defense, and that is not activated when it comes to China or East Asia or expanded into the economic domain. So in other words, what China wants to do is minimize or slow down Europe's degree of alignment with the United States in the context of great power competition. So its focus rather is on damage control or damage limitation. It doesn't want to turn Europe into an ally. That's too ambitious and realistic an objective. In contrast, the US aims precisely for that kind of alliance activation. So to get Europeans to buy into the notion of China as a strategic or systemic competitor and align with the United States on issues ranging from trade, investment and technology to diplomatic support of Taiwan, Hong Kong, or territorial disputes in the Indo-Pacific. Now, in the middle of all this, and against this backdrop, the EU and its member states are seeking to affirm their own strategic autonomy, which is something that in academic terms we usually define as the capacity to formulate and implement policies free from external influence. Of course, autonomy, for you to be autonomous, you need to have sufficient power to withstand pressure from an external, right? And now because of the, so that means that individual member states, have a very low chance of being autonomous vis-a-vis the United States and China, because simply the raw power gap is too large, right? However, in an EU context, the combined raw resources of EU member states provides at least a theoretical, a formidable, I would say, foundation for autonomy, which means that Europe's degree of autonomy in US-China competition hinges ultimately on the ability of Europe to stick together. So cohesion, unity is really the center of gravity, is really the ultimate barometer of European autonomy in US-China competition. Now, having said that, power, of course, is often context dependent. Europe's degree of unity and cohesion varies significantly across policy areas and across individual issues. But also the priority that the United States and China assign to Europe, the intensity of the pressure they decide to apply to Europe, or the leverage that they have over Europe, also can vary enormously from one issue to another, or from one policy area to another. What does that mean? Well, that means that European autonomy is characteristically relative and contingent as a concept, right? Now, to sort of come full circle and reconnect with the main theme of the conference, I would say that Europe is both a player and a playground in US-China competition, and I think our focus should be on understanding why and when one condition, i.e. player or playground, is more prevalent than the other. But of course, being a player today does not just depend on navigating US and Chinese expectations. It also increasingly requires Europeans to recognize that what happens in the Indo-Pacific region is no longer detached from Europe's own security environment and from Europe's economic prosperity, because the Indo-Pacific region is the center of gravity of US-China competition. And that means that the credibility of the multilateral order that Europeans hold so dear, the resilience of the economic and technological systems on which Europeans depend, and even the stability and security of Europe itself are all shaped by how great power competition plays out in the Indo-Pacific, not least because Europe's own security guarantor is prioritizing the Indo-Pacific region, and its actions in the European theater are indirectly determined by its needs in the Indo-Pacific, which is the primary theater. So I would say that, to sort of wrap up, that Europe's challenge is not so much to choose sides in a new, in an emerging bipolar or increasingly bipolar context, because Europe is actually part of one side. And I think that's unavoidable. But rather, the key focus for Europe, the key challenge for Europe, is to determine its own level of ambition, right? It can either remain a playground, so a space where external actors compete for influence, or it can consolidate its internal unity, economic leverage and diplomatic reach to shape outcomes, including in the Indo-Pacific region. So if Europe wants to remain a strategic actor, it will need to invest in those areas that give it leverage in a world where competition is global and cross-regional. So technology, trade resilience, maritime presence, and partnerships with like-minded Indo-Pacific states. None of this will always require alignment with every US preference or confrontation with China in every single issue, but it does require a sense of where Europe's interests lie and the capacity to act on them. And I think that ultimately will determine whether Europe remains a player or becomes increasingly a playground in the years ahead. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Luis, for your assessment. Player or playground, that remains to be seen. But now let me hand over to Tanguy Struye. He is a professor of international relations at the Catholic University of Louvain. and he is a research associate at the Brussels-based think tank Egmont Institute. He specializes, amongst others, in geopolitics, geoeconomics, the foreign and defense policy of the major powers, USA, China and Russia, and the Indo-Pacific regions. Thanks.
So, good evening. I'm going also to talk about the EU. Just let you know that I am the devil's advocate, and Alfred is the guy who's going to say very positive things about the EU. So we're going to talk about the geoeconomics. So what is important, first of all, of course, is that we are today in an era of global competition. So new wave of imperialism. Look at Trump, Modi, President Xi, and so on. That means that we are in an era of competition with self-help, importance of slugs, but also, and that's going to be also my main element here tonight, is the new conquest for minerals. And that's where we're going to see that Europe is very, very, very far away from the Chinese or the Americans. So we are clearly, when we talk about geoeconomy, at the return of mercantilism, meaning I win, you lose. So it's finished, this idea of win-win. Clearly, it's still the European approach, but clearly not the Chinese one, or the American one, or even the Russian, and even actually the Indians. So what does that mean in practice? Less globalization, and also the fact that for many states, and certainly since the war in Ukraine and COVID-19, outsourcing made actually economies very vulnerable. So with COVID-19, we see all that with the masks. We were depending on China. And of course, with Ukraine, we saw that with gas. So because of this competition between great powers, the objective, of course, is to actually be less dependent on other states, meaning the rivals. What does that mean also in practice? Well, all these big guys, so the big powers, are back towards the spheres of influences. We see that with the Americans, with the southern hemisphere, with also Canada, Greenland, and so on. We see that with India in Southeast Asia, China in Southeast Asia, Russia, of course, with Ukraine. So all of them have the same logics of sphere of influences. The only one who still are not thinking about sphere of influences, guess who? Is, of course, Europe. So once again, we are clearly waiting. I don't know what exactly, but clearly the others are moving, and we are actually standing by. So that is clearly an issue. I'm going a little bit further. But is that something new? Actually, no. And here again, Europe should not be surprised, because already in 1841, there was a guy, Friedrich List, who was talking about the theory of effent industries, meaning that every time there is a new industry, and nowadays it's new technologies, you will have one element that is coming back, protectionism. So every state will actually defend its technology, because before it's become mature, they don't want to share it. So what we see with the Chinese, the Americans, and others is actually normal. Everyone is talking about new things, but actually the fact that everyone is defending this new technology, and think about artificial intelligence, biotech, nanotech, and so on, is absolutely not something new. And we actually should have been prepared. And here I mean, once again, Europe, and we were not. So the fact that we have this competition between these great powers is absolutely something that we should be prepared for. So we are now in the era of geoeconomics, meaning competition, competition, and competition about everything, about norms, about standards, about, of course, semiconductors, about minerals, just think about rare earths, and so on and so on. So if we follow specialists in geoeconomics, we are now in what we call strategic capitalism. What does that mean in practice? Well, it means that if you want to sell your apples and your pears to China, okay. If you want to sell semiconductors to China, that's finished. Meaning the state will determine if you can or not sell semiconductors toward China. That's something we have seen for the last actually 7-8 years with the first Trump administration, then Biden and Trump. And we see that also with the Chinese concerning, for example, rare earths and all the issues that we saw the last few months. So it means that states are now partially controlling the economy and also actually the multinationals. Something we start here in Europe to get and to understand, but we once again are very, very slow to actually, in some way, update our policies. And the fact is that for China, for India, for the US, and also for others, it's all about technological sovereignty and economic security. So everything is about controlling the supply chain. And guess what? The Chinese are winning. So we are clearly not winning. And when I say we, it's US and the EU. So every state is really in a logic of made in. Made in China, made in South Korea, made in Japan, made in Vietnam. And it's not only about the US, because everyone is now concentrated on Trump, but actually the Chinese are doing even worse than the Trump administration, or even Indians with the tariffs are actually also very active. So it's not about decoupling, but actually more about de-risking. So decoupling is the idea that you can separate the economy of Europe with the one of China, for example. That will not become reality. The reason is we can't do it because we depend too much on China for so many things that decoupling is not possible. The Australians made a study that it would take years and years and years before they could decouple from China. So imagine the European Union or even the US. So we are in logic of de-risking, meaning everything that is linked to new technologies you control, and eventually you will export, but clearly not the most modern stuff, but only second-hand semiconductors. That's okay for China, but not the new ones. So how can you then not depend or less depend on China, for example, for rare earths? Well, you do what we call friend-shoring or nearshoring, meaning that if you depend for almost 100% on rare earths coming from China, but it's competition with China, they can blackmail you. What are you going to do? Well, you try to find alternatives. So the Americans, even under Trump, have understood that. And for example, when Trump was in the Indo-Pacific last week, they made a lot of agreements with Japan, South Korea, Malaysia, Vietnam, Australia, and so on. I'm still waiting for Europe, okay? But the fact is that they were actually trying to find and diverse their resources to be less dependent on China and clearly less dependent concerning rare earths. So Europe depends almost at 100% on Chinese rare earths, okay? And without the rare earths, you don't have all these new technologies. So you can imagine how they can blackmail us without any problem. And it's exactly what they are doing. So we have United States and China who are clearly in a logic of competition. They have been preparing for the last 10 years for this competition. So they have already a lot of policies that are present, that are actually present in the sense that they are clearly in a logic of protectionism and certainly concerning the new technologies. And so what about Europe? Well, in theory, we should be like this. In practice, it's like this. So once again, we discuss a lot, but the others are advancing and we are not. So that's really a problem. Also, there's internal competition inside Europe, and this was the most famous fight a few years ago between these two leaders. So that means that Europe is clearly very, very slow compared to the Chinese and the Americans. And that's clearly a problem when we want to play or not, and be at the playground or not, or be a player. Well, I would say that more and more we are starting to be the playground and not the player anymore. Just to give you one or two examples very fast, we had this very nice law act, the Critical Raw Material Act, so that the idea is to have our own resources, minerals, but the problem is that we need to do that for 2030. So the idea is to actually open mines and things like that, and to be able to compete with the Chinese, even the Americans, on some of the resources we need. The problem is that to open a mine, you need between 5 and 10 years. So just imagine we started in 2025, we need to be ready in 2030, but the mines will not be open before 2030 or 2035. So you can imagine, once again, the theory and the practice. So that is clearly a big, big problem. And the other problem we have in Europe is NIMBY, not in my backyard. We want green energy, but no way that the resources come from Europe. We prefer to have them from Africa, China, and so on. The reason, pollution. So here again, we have big, big problems. Another element was the Draghi report. Very important report. Everyone was okay 1 year ago to say it's a very important report. 1 year later, only 10% of the report has become reality. So once again, why are we waiting so much for these things? Other issues are the fragmentation of industrial capacity. We are still not working together. The bureaucracy is still one of the biggest problems concerning or innovation, and then also energy. You need to know that energy is 3 to 4 times more expensive than in the US. So clearly that is also a big, big problem. And finally, we have many weak leaders, and certainly this generation. So it's very hard, of course, with weak leaders to have a strong EU policy. So as you can see, my presentation is very positive, very optimistic. But I think it's also important to show that there are a lot of things that are not going well in the EU, and that China and US, even under Trump, are actually advancing. And so, but as I mentioned, someone will be a little bit more positive on the EU in a few minutes. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Tanguy, for showing us what went wrong and what the EU was missing. But as you said, we're going to hear now more about what the EU should do or can do, especially in the Southeast Asia. Yeah. So, but before we are going to hear the results of the project that was funded by EU, the European Union in the Volatile Indo-Pacific Region, which was coordinated by Alfred Gerstl and Kristina Kironska. I would like to give a short introduction. Alfred Gerstl is a specialist in international relations with a focus on the Indo-Pacific and especially Southeast Asia. He is an associate professor and leads the project, the EU in the Volatile Indo-Pacific Region at Palacký University Olomouc in Czechia, and he is president of the think tank Central European Institute of Asian Studies, and he is also a senior advisor at the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy. Kristina focuses in her work on international relations and human rights in East Asia and Southeast Asia. She serves as co-director at the Central Europe Institute of Asian Studies, and she is also an assistant professor at Palacký University Olomouc in Czechia, where she, as I said, coordinates the project EUVIP. And she has also lived and worked in both Myanmar and Taiwan. Please.
Thanks, Marlies. Before we start with our presentation, please let me add one more affiliation, because it's really important. I also see some of my students here. I'm also a lecturer here at the Diplomatic Academy. So basically, I'm representing all the logos you see here. So before we start, and Kristina's and my aim is to build on the previous presentation to actually to not only talk about what's going wrong within the EU or in the Indo-Pacific or global level, but also to provide you an outlook what opportunities the EU can actually make use of. Before we do so, however, let me also briefly introduce you to the EUVIP project. It's actually a fascinating project. Only downside, it will end in 5 weeks. It will end in 5 weeks. It was a Horizon Europe twinning project. So Palacký University Olomouc is the coordinator, and we're happy to have excellent partners, University of Helsinki, Lund University, Université catholique de Louvain, and colleagues from all projects partners are also here with us today. If you're interested, you can also actually go to the QR code, then it will lead you to the website and you can read more about the project. Our idea was to focus on the Indo-Pacific region, and for this we applied the geographic definition of the European Union, which is actually the second closest. You also see the Japanese one in blue, which includes the United States. Makes sense for Japan, because for them, US is the vital security guarantor. For the European Union, it's similar. Indo-Pacific includes the east coast of Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Oceania, that ends in the Pacific Islands. So for all the Indo-Pacific concepts, important is basically, if you look at the geographic position, Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia, the South China Sea, is the geographic heart of the Indo-Pacific. The South China Sea, to give you a figure, 40% of the global trade, including the European Union's trade, pass through the South China Sea. Another crucial choke point is, of course, Taiwan Strait. So therefore, what's happening in regard to the sea lanes of communication is of vital interest of the European Union. In the project, we ask two, not too simple questions. The first one is, how can the EU contribute more prominently to strengthening the multilateral, rules-based and ASEAN-centered order in the Indo-Pacific? ASEAN stands for the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, has today 11 members, so all Southeast Asian countries, and has established the only transcontinental multilateral structures in the Indo-Pacific: politics, economics, security, so therefore it's a crucial partner. We looked at ASEAN-EU relations, but also at the South China Sea dispute. The second question is, how can the EU do so without compromising its values-based foreign policy, which means strong emphasis on the promotion of human rights and democracy? Of course, we started almost 3 years ago, and since then the world has completely changed, with Donald Trump returning to office. So therefore, there's also pressure on the EU to actually rebalance its approach towards values and interests. Our specific case studies are Myanmar and Taiwan. As part of the project, let me quickly run through it, we established an Indo-Pacific hub at Palacký University Olomouc, so it's a very good platform for further cooperation. So also, if you're interested in our work, please feel free to approach us after this talk. Another institution we established, another center, is the Myanmar Study Center, and I'm glad, Kristina, you're in charge of it, so if you can provide us more information about the center.
So yeah, this is another outcome of the project, and this center is one of its kind. You don't have a lot of academic Myanmar study centers around the world, so this one is the only one in Europe, and we have 3 goals. We want to create a knowledge hub and attract researchers to come and do research with us on Myanmar. We want to integrate Myanmar into the broader curriculum at our university, and we also have various kinds of events such as conferences, summer schools, or other public events. We wanted to introduce to you also the Myanmar coup tracker, where we collected factual information about the coup since the very beginning, so you can check it out. And when speaking about trackers, we have a few of those. So the EU-Taiwan tracker, that's a tracker by the Central European Institute of Asian Studies, is something like a data dashboard for the EU and the 27 EU members. We collect data since 2019. And you can find all kinds of engagement between Europe and Taiwan on political, economic, and societal interactions. For example, you can filter by country. So we wanted to, since we are now here in Austria, we wanted to show you how you can filter events that are related to Austria. And here you can see 2 quite high-level visits from Taiwan to Austria and from Austria to Taiwan.
There's a third tracker, it's the European Southeast Asian Relations Tracker, which is actually a major outcome of another project, a EU-funded project I conduct at CEIAS. And here we have a focus on EU-ASEAN relations and also the Central European countries, including Austria. And I've seen our former ambassador to Malaysia and also see that the Austrian-Malaysian society is very representative today. So I'm really happy that, especially between Austria and Malaysia, there are actually many, many interactions, just to emphasize it. But let us now focus on our policy recommendations. Luckily, we can build on the previous presentations, and we actually agree with Louis, with Tanguy's assessments. We are living in a different world, so geopolitics, geoeconomics, great power politics, they actually challenge the EU and also its self-conception as a soft power, a normative power, economic power, lacking military and coercive force. So therefore, we really ask, is it enough to be a good international citizens in our world, or do the EU need to define different means of influence and power? So therefore, one of our recommendations we make is that the EU should reconceptualize its role in international affairs, and this new role conception must be based on a realistic assessment of its strategic objective, its core values and core interests, and last but not least, the practical means for implementation. So it should really be realistic assessment and implementation. Also, something we discussed in the beginning, and happy to discuss it with you further in the Q&A, is we also agree that the EU needs to stand stronger together, and one option is a federal model. But is it realistic? That's, of course, also something that needs to be discussed. An easier, but more difficult way or strategy is when it comes to the common foreign security policy, we still have consensus principle among the 27 members. So why do not move to also majority decision making in the foreign and security policy? That would be one approach. Or a step back would be to form so-called coalitions of the willing in certain policy area, which means maybe 5, 6, 7 member states start working together. The others can later opt in or stand out. However, if they don't cooperate in this coalition, then they don't interfere and don't disturb the others. The Eurozone would be such an example. Also, again, here we are, like in the previous presentation, back to Donald Trump. The world has changed, and this also means we agree that the EU's approach to apply a values-based policy distinguishes it positively from other actors. However, we also have to ask critically, is it still time to prioritize values, or is there a need to better balance values and interests? And I would say, yes, there is a certain need. However, it also depends, of course, on the policy area, the region or country this approach is applied to. Also, we do also subscribe to the term like-minded partners, which the EU, but also Japan, Australia, India, South Korea use. Like-minded partners has the advantage it includes Taiwan, for instance. However, We also have to be realistic globally, but especially in the Indo-Pacific, the majority of the countries is governed by semi-democratic or even authoritarian regimes. So therefore, majority are non-democratic, which requires a flexible, pragmatic response. De-risking, that is definitely an important and useful strategy. However, it should not only be applied economically to China, but also when it comes to security to the United States, because our security still depends on the US, on NATO, so therefore the EU must take more and credible steps. Tanguy has discussed the China factor, so among our team we believe, yes, there is need to cooperate with China in certain areas, but a really close strategic partnership would be a mistake, strategically, but also in regard to economic relations. A natural partner for Europe is Southeast Asia, and here again, in particular, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. EU, ASEAN, they have close relations. There's also diplomatic support for ASEAN centrality. However, in certain cases, there should also be, let's call it, non-public criticism in the talks with ASEAN members, for instance, when it comes to Myanmar or other cases, or yes, human rights and democracy issues. Also, our recommendation is that the EU should not only pursue bilateral trade agreements with individual Southeast Asian nations, but really aim for the more ambitious regional free trade agreement with the now 11 ASEAN members. Also, of course, Southeast Asia, important partner, but the EU can also cooperate with other key players in the Indo-Pacific like Australia, India, Japan, South Korea, bilaterally or unilaterally, and can contribute together to maintaining order in Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific. Hedging, it is a very promising and also at least partly successful strategy in the Indo-Pacific, notably Southeast Asia. Just to summarize, it means the refusal of the governments to choose between the United States and China, to try to balance them, and for this, they need additional partners. So therefore, the EU, but also Japan, India, are basically structurally welcome. So there are certain opportunities due to the different foreign policies of other countries for the EU to step in. So one question I would really like to pose also to the audience, well, if hedging works for Southeast Asian Indo-Pacific countries, it may also work for the European Union, because to really highlight this, the EU is not at the same power level as China or the United States. So we could say we are in secondary power, and therefore, why not applying a hedging strategy? This doesn't mean we are ideological neutral. I mean, we are clearly in the pro-Western, in the US camp, but it offers opportunities to also cooperate in certain areas with China that are of mutual interest for both sides. Another promising approach, and this combines also the approach Coalition of the Willing, is the Team Europe approach, which makes a lot of sense, which means the European Commission cooperates with individual member states. Global Gateway Initiative is such an approach. But Team Europe would also apply to the Central European countries. And here I really know that our new ambassador to Malaysia, he's working with the colleagues from Slovakia, Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland, because they know together they have a stronger voice in Malaysia and the broader region. So here there's also possibility for European countries to cooperate. What we also recommend is a stronger, in general, a stronger presence of European politicians, but also, for instance, of European Navy in Southeast Asia, to show that we are committed to the region and also committed to do sometimes dirty work. An example would be annual joint drills with Southeast Asian partners, or so-called freedom of navigation operations, to really show that the EU is willing to uphold freedom of navigation and freedom of trade. What we learned in our talks with colleagues, with diplomats in Indo-Pacific, in Southeast Asia particular, is that the EU has been often criticized for not listening to local voices, to local demands. So here it would really be important to take different opinion perspectives serious and don't speak to them from a feeling of moral superiority and also no Eurocentrism. So preaching human rights, democracy, that is actually backfires. So I think there should be a stronger understanding, even so we are all in favor of human rights, democracy. We know that democracy is a long-term process and it may take longer than we wish for, but we have to accept it that it really takes time. We are also asked to be positively. So 27 is actually a very good year for the EU, provides a golden opportunity because it's 50 years of EU-ASEAN relations. So there are really many opportunities for meetings, but what we want to emphasize is to really show up, not only a few heads of state of government, but really all 27, plus Ursula von der Leyen as president of the Commission, so to really show that EU is committed to Southeast Asia and Indo-Pacific and play a role there. Also, the Global Gateway Initiative, which is a counter-offer to China's Belt and Road Initiative. So the first phase expires in 27. It's now a negotiation, how it should proceed. But here, the EU can already present clearer plans and again show their commitment that it will further invest in infrastructure and, yes, in connectivity. Also, last but not least here on the slide, also important is that the EU should talk more proactively about what kind of projects it conducts in the Indo-Pacific area, because many of them are indeed beneficial, not only for the governments, but also for the citizens. But for this, you also need the appropriate social media, appropriate language to target people. Last but not least here, important is that if you make compromises as EU or national governments, really stick to the promises and deliver tangible benefits to the citizens. And one example where the EU can make a difference is the case of Myanmar.
Okay, so since Myanmar was one of our case studies in the project and we're speaking about Southeast Asia today, let us zoom into Myanmar a little bit. So the military coup in 2021 brought political repression, violent conflict, and institutional collapse in the country. There's the National Unity Government, which is a parallel government operating in exile, which continues to resist the military together with the PDFs, People's Defense Forces, and the ethnic armed organizations, EAOs. But still, it's quite violent. As you can see on the slides, the numbers. So there have been more than 30,000 people that have been arrested since the coup, and more than 7,000 that have been killed. And these are quite conservative estimates, as it's really just about the civilians, not those who actually took up arms and went to fight. The resistance movement that we can see now is quite unprecedented. It has a vision for a new democratic Myanmar and a federal Myanmar. So it differs quite much from previous movements. Still, international support, particularly from the EU, has fallen short. The EU imposed sanctions on 100 individuals tied to the military, and also created a position of a special envoy. But despite this, development aid has dropped by 70% since the coup. So we think that the EU should rethink its approach. And here come into play our policy recommendations. So firstly, humanitarian aid. The military is obstructing military aid in many parts of the country, and there's a lot of people in need of it. There's 3.6 million internally displaced people, 200,000 cross-border refugees, and 20 million people in urgent need of aid. So in this case, the EU should prioritize supporting humanitarian channels that reach territories outside of the military control, and work with ethnic service providers, including civil society networks. Then the EU should also support parallel governance, because the NUG, the parallel government that I mentioned, together with the ethnic armed organizations, they are building alternative governance institutions, and they're providing in those places that they control justice, healthcare, and education. So the EU should provide targeted technical assistance and training to strengthen these governance efforts. The EU should also engage with non-state actors, because those cannot be ignored any longer. Many of those people, defense forces and the ethnic arms organizations, they hold de facto authority in many of the regions in Myanmar. And they should be recognized, and their role should be recognized as essential political stakeholders, rather than replicate what has been done in the past, a more top-down model that excluded ethnic voices. The EU should also foster regional cooperation, especially with Thailand, India, and Bangladesh. That's crucial for enabling cross-border humanitarian aid corridors, for example. And then also what we can do here in Europe would be support education programming, especially now with the gap that has been created after the US aid left the region. So the European Union can support education by non-junta actors, educators, and also expand European scholarships, such as, for example, the EMPM project, and there's also other ones. Last but not least, this recommendation is, let's say, more actionable, and it also concerns more the EU members rather than the EU. They should simplify the visa procedures, because the visa procedures in many countries make it very difficult for Burmese scholars, students, researchers to come and work with us at European institutions, especially because of the police clearance letter that, as you can see the table here, some of the EU member states require, while others don't. And why this is complicated? It's because this one paper that you need for the visa, you have to apply at the police in Myanmar, which is under military control. So the current process lacks credibility, and also it can potentially expose those that apply for the visa to persecution, detention, or even forced conscription. Let's not forget that many of the people who were involved in the CDM, civil disobedience movement, by the military regime, they are perceived as criminals. So this is just a little bit to get into how complicated it is. And if you want to know more, there's a QR code to an article that explains this very much into detail, as we don't have that much time to get into it.
So it's a big thank you to you for your attention, and very much looking forward to your comments.
Thank you, Alfred and Kristina. So to wrap up, we learned a lot today about why the European Union and Europe should act as a player in the Indo-Pacific and Southeast Asia, not only because of economical reasons, but also because of security reasons, and maybe also to secure, as Washington has shown us, some deals regarding critical minerals. Yeah, and we heard how Europe can maybe become a player in the region. I would now like to open the floor for questions, and also to be able to, that our online audience can participate. I would like to maybe get a digital device to be able to connect them, to connect with our online audience. Okay, so are there any questions in the audience? Okay, I will gather 2 to 3 questions, please.
Yes, Vincent from Vienna. To Myanmar, a very quick question about how is facing Myanmar, especially during this civil war situation, to the multi-ethnic conflicts, and about EU, PRC, and US policy is about how it's EU joint diplomacy to PRC. If we consider the tariff deal between EU and USA in Scotland during the summer, President von der Leyen just shared this false laugh to President Donald Trump making the deal. And what happens in Germany, for example, lastly, the foreign minister even didn't visit China. Instead, the Spanish royal family was in China, and in this way, somehow, audience can also see this contrast of EU country diplomacy to PRC. Here are my questions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think there also was a question.
I'm the chairman of the Austrian NATO Enlargement Committee. I have two questions. The first one is about the summit which we just had and the recent trade agreements between the EU and the ASEAN countries. There's a little bit of a patchwork here, and we have not really concluded all the agreements. I thought that we had actually an ASEAN agreement with the EU ready, but now we have just done Indonesia, and the other countries, I'm still missing a lot of them. So why are we not bolder? Because ASEAN should be a natural partner of the European Union. And for my main topic is, of course, defense and NATO. I was reading in the Cold War, we had this kind of strategic, the Americans basically had their own NATO for Southeast Asia at that times, from the 50s to the 1970s. What exactly was the reasons why it broke apart? Why don't we have a partnership with Southeast Asia right now? Maybe not led by the Americans, but led by the Europeans, and build a kind of natural counterbalance against India, which unfortunately is with the Chinese now and with the Russians, and China obviously a hostile country. And so this is a natural partnership which we could now give if we are a little bit more courageous and a little bit forthcoming to our friends in Southeast Asia. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. Let us stop here for the moment. I think the question regarding Myanmar is perfect for Kristina.
Yep, that's right. So yeah, that's a good question about what the EU, the EU has not really been very influential in Myanmar. For example, the sanctions, there was a couple of rounds of sanctions, but I would consider them kind of toothless. You know, after all, those Burmese generals, their assets are tied up more in the US than in the EU. So on one hand, it's symbolic, but I mean, how much it can actually achieve on the ground, that's very questionable. And also there were some attempts in ASEAN to deal with the situation in Myanmar. We kind of know that it also didn't really go well. ASEAN didn't achieve much. And part of the reason is that China has a lot of influence in the country. Economic, political, and China is actually able to play both sides. So we know that it provides some assistance also to parts of the resistance movement, but it's also very much tied together with the Burmese military.
We have another question regarding the trade agreement between ASEAN and the EU. Maybe you want to answer that?
Mm-hmm. There was also one regarding the security partnership, so if I may start with it. Yes, we had in the 50s, 70s the so-called Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, and the problem was that the majority of the members were non-Southeast Asian countries. Only a few participated, was led by the United States and the former colonial powers. So there was also a lack of trust among the partners, and it did fall apart during the Vietnam War because of the double role of the United States. Can the EU become a security provider for Southeast Asia? The answer is no. EU has no standing army. Also, when it comes to our naval resources, we are very much limited. So we have France, we have Germany, we have the Netherlands, you can add Spain, Italy, but their naval projection capabilities, they are highly limited. So maybe once a year, 1 or 2 European vessels sail through the South China Sea or Taiwan Strait, but this is already a strong message. So I would definitely emphasize there's a need to keep this up, but to be a security provider for Southeast Asia, that's not realistic. But below this level, there are partnerships, and that's the Team Europe approach. So European countries are major weapons providers to Southeast Asia. There are possibility for training activities, joint military drills, so also intelligence sharing. Also, when it comes to non-traditional security, I think the EU is a strong and welcome partner. But of course, we are not the US, and also Japan provides many more really tangible goods when it comes to security as the EU.
Okay.
Yeah, just very briefly on that question as well, if I may, which is I think it's a very good question. I mean and sort of following up on what Alfred was saying, there's in the academic literature in international security, there's a lot of debate as to why, because as you know, the alliance structure of East Asia in general and Europe, they both have a very similar, they both have a very strong similarity, which is that they're both structured around the United States and US extended deterrence guarantees, right? But there's a lot of debate as to why the alliance structure in Europe is multilateral and the one in Southeast Asia is bilateral, right? Hub and spokes, Japan, US, US ROK, US Thailand, US Australia, and so on. And interestingly, I would say that in the last few years, in the last decade, the reason had to do with the fact that most US allies in East Asia had very different security needs, right? The South Koreans were focusing on the ROK, the Japanese were focusing primarily at the time on the Soviet Union, the Taiwanese or the Republic of China, mostly on China, so they had different reference, right? Whereas in the Euro-Atlantic region, the threat reference was a single one, right? Now with China rising and growing as a military power, that's sort of galvanizing more and more attention in Southeast Asia, even though, for instance, the ROK is still primarily focused about DPRK. And you've seen, interestingly, in the last decade or so, that alliance ecosystem evolve from a bilateral structure to more and more minilaterals, right? For instance, we've seen the growth of US, Japan, South Korea, trilateral cooperation, US, Japan, Australia, trilateral cooperation, even the quadrilateral, right? So we're seeing an evolution. And you've seen, during the Biden administration actually gave a big push to this notion of collectivizing the alliance architecture in Southeast Asia. And you've seen Eli Ratner, for instance, who was Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Indo-Pacific, so who was the Indo-Pacific czar at the Pentagon under Biden, came up with this proposal that's gathered a lot of attention of a Pacific Pact, which would be an Asian NATO, if you will, including primarily Japan, Australia, the US, and the Philippines, because those are the countries that you need if your focus is to deter China, but also leaving the door open to others like the ROK or Taiwan. So I think this is a very good question. It's a very lively debate. I think in a way, things are sort of moving in that direction. Of course, to have a nation NATO is very complicated because there are still frictions, particularly there lingering between between Japan and ROK, for instance. So there are still animosities, but we are sort of moving. Things seem to be trending in that direction.
Okay. There is a question over there.
Yes, my name's Ron Willis. I originate from New Zealand. Correct me if I'm wrong, but ASEAN is a very informal organization. It's almost what you might call a chat club. It doesn't have any formal means of imposing obligations, very unlike the EU. My understanding, if you want to make agreements in ASEAN, you have to make agreements with each individual members of ASEAN. This must limit the scope of what you can arrange with ASEAN. I'd like your comment on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. There is another question over here.
Yeah, my name is Gabriele Weichert from University of Vienna, and I've got a question to Alfred and Kristina about the project, because you mentioned that one of the case studies, or the other one, is Taiwan. And can you tell us a little bit about the assessment and recommendations to the European Union about that country or region? Thank you.
Okay, and we'll have another question if there is one. No. Ah, yeah, over here.
Well, I was once serving in Southeastern Asia, and still I have the impression that each country of Europe is working it's on its own, and there is not so much together. And I also wonder, historically speaking, of course, the British had quite some influence, and isn't it possible to cooperate a little bit with the British also? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Who wants to answer first?
Turn on the mic. The question was directed to ASEAN. Well, I would argue that behind the European Union, ASEAN is the most deeply integrated and cooperating regional organization. Of course, there are now 11 members with different national interests, but we have the same in Europe. And nevertheless, ASEAN managed to establish trans-regional, even continental institutions. That's the ASEAN Regional Forum, that's the East Asia Summit. East Asia Summit is the reason why Donald Trump traveled to Malaysia and then further to South Korea for the APEC Summit. So ASEAN has still some relevance. However, the problem is, and my previous speaker have pointed it out, the problem is the ASEAN approach to foreign policy and diplomacy only works in a world where neither Trump nor Xi Jinping ask them clearly, are you with us or are you against us? So it's this kind of balancing, mediating between the great powers, also the secondary powers, that actually gives ASEAN a strength. But it's, again, I would agree, it's out of a position of weakness, of course. It's not a military alliance, and it's not as deeply integrated as the EU, that's for sure. We actually, I know we talked about Europe, sometimes the EU. I think whenever we spoke about Europe, we have included the United Kingdom, because the United Kingdom, also economically, strong partner, of course. Together with France, it's the only European power with a strong military power projection capabilities. Also, Great Britain, you mentioned it, it had colonies. It still has close relations with Malaysia, Singapore, of course, also Australia. So I think that's a huge advantage we should not easily forfeit.
Yes, concerning your question, what is interesting is that if you look at ASEAN, there is no ASEAN NATO, clearly. But what is interesting is if you look at Quad, no ASEAN. Squad, no ASEAN. AUKUS, no ASEAN. NATO +4, no ASEAN. So what I mean by that is all the big ones that are cooperation, security, military cooperations, is actually all without ASEAN. The thing is, you will find some countries, for example, now they are talking about Philippines, US, and Japan, if I'm not wrong, working together, but once again, it's not ASEAN. So I don't think ASEAN will be able to work together as potentially the EU or a new NATO, and I think it will be pure bilateral between ASEAN countries and the ones in the region, or ASEAN and the US, and maybe ASEAN and some EU countries. I'm not even sure that it will be EU, ASEAN in military issues.
Okay, thank you. We had another question posed directly to Kristina.
All right, so let me answer the question about Myanmar. So that's another case study that we had. We actually have a report coming out in a week or two where we look at EU's relations with Taiwan, and then we zoom in on each of the EU members to look at how these relations differ. And let me tell you, we have categorized the European countries into 4 groups. So one would be the old friends, for example, Germany, that they had relations for a long time. So there's a lot of cooperation going on. But then you have, maybe for some, a surprising group that we categorized as the new partners. Many of these countries are in Central and Eastern Europe that kind of discovered or rediscovered Taiwan. This comes partially maybe from the broader disillusionment with China, especially if you think about the grouping 16+1, later 17+1, currently 14+1. So a lot of these countries then pivoted towards Taiwan. Then the third group would be the pragmatists. So these countries have pragmatic relations with Taiwan. So there's some economic ties, but on a political level, these are rather invisible. And then we have the last group, the fourth group, the laggards. Here, there's not much going on between those countries and Taiwan. They very often wouldn't even have a representative office in Taiwan or Taiwan in that country. So when we look at the European level, we can also see that there's more cooperation going on. This has, of course, to do also with the shifting position of the EU towards China, also with the Indo-Pacific strategy, and with looking at Taiwan as a like-minded partner. So you can see that there's also more and more visits to Taiwan, even on the European level. So you have MEP delegations. I think 2-3 years ago there was the first such delegation going to Taiwan. There's collaboration on many different topics. One of the topics would be FIMI, so foreign interference operations. And then when we look at how, for example, from the point of view of think tanks in Europe, it's also very interesting to look at how think tanks have dealt with Taiwan. So before the year 2000, there was hardly any mention of Taiwan. Maybe after 2010, Taiwan was mentioned adjacent to China or in economic terms. And let's say after maybe 2015, closer to 2020, Taiwan is being mentioned very often, taken into consideration as a player of its own. So kind of like starting to be detached from China studies. And this trend is also reflected in our book, which is going to be published tomorrow. And the title is Contemporary Taiwan, More Than a Flashpoint. So we kind of want to separate Taiwan from China.
Thank you, Kristina. Are there any questions? Yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you. I spent 11 years as an Austrian diplomat in the Far East, Japan, China, and Malaysia. And definitely, wherever you're sitting, you have a different perspective on how things are. But one region, you mentioned it, South China Sea, the Spratlys, Paracelsus Islands, reclaimed by China. And militarily, I think, fortified quite a bit, but so important for maritime transportation. So what can Europe really do? I mean, you mentioned, of course, the colonial powers, Britain, but I would not forget that France, after all, is a nuclear power and is on New Caledonia, is in Tahiti, and if you take the Indian Ocean in Réunion. So I suppose if Britain and France are cooperating, of course, with the partners like Australia, New Zealand, Singapore in particular, because with the military regimes like Myanmar, even Thailand, I mean, you even had a short war on the border. This is I would say, the very weak point of the ASEAN community, but I agree EU should continue to cooperate with them. Just a little question on Myanmar. You didn't mention at all the thorny Rohingya problem because it's not only concerning Myanmar, Bangladesh, but we have witnessed hundreds of refugees in Malaysia. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. There is another question in the back.
Hi everyone, my name is Sidan. I'm from CEIAS fellow and also teaching at WU. I'm originally from Indonesia, so this platform is really nice. So I have questions for Dr. Kironska. So I'm wondering from your presentations, I perceive that the aid from the EU is less. Maybe I'm wrong. If it does, so I'm wonder why then the EU aid or how do you say, support to Myanmar went down. So by identify that problem, maybe we can approach the funding better to Myanmar. Second, about the presentation from Mr. Tanguy, yeah, if I may. Well, I agree with most of your message. Also, you mentioned my favorite economist, Friedrich List. He died in Kufstein, basically. Yeah. So my questions would be like, also maybe Mr. Lewis also would like to give response. Why then EU took almost 10 years to sign the agreement with Indonesia last September, right? The discussions was 2016. I, as an Indonesian, perceive as after you being dumped by America, now you look for, oh, Indonesia, in Borneo and Sulawesi, you have some nickel that we need for EV industry. Right? Let's move. And just one more. And second is, I'm also thinking that, is there any, how do you say, we call it, in economics, we call it neighboring effect. Is it because you compete with China, then now you start to move to make this agreement? In fact, I'm thinking there's a problem with this agreement. So if EU with this agreement trying to capture the resources, right, for the EV industry or rare earth or minerals, you will need to import those materials from Indonesia, which will be exported by mostly foreign companies from China who already own the minerals in Indonesia. So this hits back. So I'm kind of giving my specialty on FDI in this case, the framework. Then how does EU should behave themselves for Indonesia or ASEAN? If EU cannot provide security, should be the development partner, just like what the Japanese did in 1945 with the 3A movement. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Would you like to take over? Tanguy or Simon?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think on the maybe on the broader theme of Southeast Asia / South China Sea, I mean, I mean, just to get some clarity from my side, who does the EU need to provide security from? From China? From China? Are we talking about China? Because I mean, I think the security provider in China. I mean, if we're talking about the EU's or a potential European rather than EU, because I mean, I do agree. I mean, the UK is a key player and a key referent for Europe's approach towards the Indo-Pacific. I mean, I think I don't conceive of an EU or European military or strategic role in the Indo-Pacific separate from the United States. I just don't. I mean, I think that Europeans, if they are to project military power in the region, in peacetime and more specifically in a wartime scenario, it would be through the United States and through their alliance with the United States. And there, it's true. I mean, you do have certain European powers, particularly the French and the British, who can still project some power to the region. So I think, I mean, one of the reasons why, to go back to what Alfred was saying earlier, and also Kristina, one of the reasons why many countries in Southeast Asia are hedging is because they think that the security guarantee, however implicit might be, or the commitment to uphold the balance of military power in the region coming from the United States is unreliable. So if they feel like that about the US, how would they feel about a hypothetical European guarantee. I mean, I think Europeans, what they can do militarily in the region is augment the U.S. U.S. actions. Beyond the military domain, I think there is more space for the EU as a separate, distinct, with its own, unique selling proposition, which would be more about upholding multilateralism and rules and blah, 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 that sort of stuff. That can be a more of a distinct product from the United States. But if we're talking about projecting military power, I just don't, also because, the basing infrastructure, the intelligence infrastructure, the logistics, everything, I mean, it becomes very difficult for Europeans to project power independently in the region, let's say the South China Sea or Southeast Asia, in a meaningful manner, unless you're talking about a European superstate federation, but the pooling of all the forces. Yeah, that sounds promising, but that's, as of today, that's political science fiction, right?
Thank you. Were 2 questions posed to Kristina?
Okay, so let me first speak about the Rohingya issue. That's right, we didn't mention it in our presentation, and most of the Rohingya refugees are in Bangladesh. That bears the burden and is in dire need of finances coming from other parts of the world, because right now and in the near future, speaking of repatriation, that's just somehow not possible with the current situation inside of Myanmar. And what we mentioned in one of our policy recommendations is to involve non-state actors. That would also apply to the case of the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. If we ever want to talk about the repatriation, we have to speak with the relevant actors. In this case, most of the Rohingya people come from the Rakhine state, so a very significant actor there is the AA, the Arakan army. So this ties into that recommendation about the non-state actors. Now, when speaking about the EU aid that has significantly dropped, why? I guess there are several reasons. One of them probably is also the confusion about how to get it into the country, through which players. Myanmar is very complicated. You have all these abbreviations, NUG, PDF, EROs. So really the picture is not so black and white and not so easy to understand. So I think that hinders engagement with Myanmar. That also after the coup, EU countries had to decide whether they stay in the country, whether they keep the embassy there, whether they just downgrade but still stay there, or if they leave the country. So that also ties into all of that. And we can see that EU member countries are not so involved in Myanmar. When I spoke to several national officers, it seems that they're always waiting for what the EU does and then just follow what the EU does, rather than, I don't know, Austria itself doing something, Slovakia doing something, France doing something. Maybe with one exception, where the Czech Republic is kind of the voice for democratic Myanmar in the European Union. So yeah, but in general, I would also say there's a lack of expertise when it comes to Myanmar. And that's one of the reasons why we actually picked Myanmar in our project, trying to highlight, trying to educate about it.
Thank you. Tanguy, there was a question posed to you about the EU-Indonesia trade deal and also about critical minerals in Indonesia.
Yeah, I didn't look at the trade deal, but the fact is for me clear that they achieved an agreement because of the international situation, meaning we depend too much on China, we need minerals. We know that the French are interested, and clearly it's all going to be about minerals. So all the agreements that we will see in the future will be about resources. And the main reason is, once again, I hate quoting Putin, but for once he was right when he said that the leader of the world would be the one who is actually controlling artificial intelligence. And it's all about artificial intelligence, but more than that. And for all these things, you need one thing: resources. So everyone is fighting for all these resources, knowing that we have this green energy transition, we have these electrical vehicles, and we have these new technologies, meaning a lot of resources. And Indonesia is very interesting. I don't remember how much you have, but it's about 90% of nickel in the world, or it's, yeah, it's clearly number one. So everyone will be very interested in Indonesia. Not necessarily for the good reasons, but then on the other hand, it's up to Indonesia to be smart and not selling their mines to China, but do the refinement that you're starting to do finally also. So that's a good thing for Indonesia as such.
Okay, we have one last question and a very quick answer. Okay.
Yes, just expanding on this matter of susceptibility concerning rare earths. I understand that just a short time ago, Trump signed an agreement with the Australians for extracting rare earths. This seems to, unless I'm unaware of a lot, I haven't seen the Europeans do it. Australia must be one of the most potentially reliable sources. It's been said that Australia is about the only country in the world that contains a whole periodic table. Why are the Europeans holding back? Yeah, am I correct that Australia is a potential source of what we need and a more secure source? And what are the Europeans doing about it?
So it's a good question in the sense that actually we have Canada, Greenland, and Australia that are clearly places where you have a lot of resources, and also South America for lithium. But for all the other ones, as you said, it's Canada, Greenland, and Australia. The fact is also that I don't have the answer, to be honest with you. I have been studying Australia for a long time as a middle power. But the fact is that every time we talk about Australia, it's about the US, or at one time China, who was a little bit too aggressive concerning the mines in Australia. But otherwise, we don't see a lot of European policy towards Australia. One potential reason is distance, to bring the resources back to Europe, but I don't think it's an excuse. Or no, exactly. But the fact is that I think once again that we didn't have a strategy, and now it's panic. So we are trying to find resources where the Chinese are not and where the Americans are not. But as you mentioned, and I mentioned also in my presentation, now they signed 8 billion contracts with the Australians. So that means that we have to be fast to have alternatives, and maybe the only ones we still have is Canada and Greenland. Greenland, I will not say a lot about Greenland, but the fact is that we don't have a lot of alternatives. And the other one is clearly another one, but we don't have any policy towards it, it's Africa. When we talk about Europe, but we don't have a strategy towards Africa. We have documents, but not a strategy. So once again, I mean, we waited for about 10, 15 years. Then we had Ukraine. Then there was a wake up for gas. And then we had all these artificial intelligence issues, green energy. And then we realized, we need resources. But the Chinese started in 1992, you have the first policy concerning rare earths. And we outsource everything that is concerning rare earth. And just to finish, just for Solvay, a Belgian firm, has now opened a refining place in La Rochelle. You know who the two first contracts they had? It's American contracts. 2 companies are going to refine in La Rochelle their resources, not one European company. So once again, Europe is Europe.
So with that, we're going to conclude. I'm not sure. Yeah. Thank you, Luis, Tanguy, Alfred, and Kristina for your insights and the presentations. Thank you, dear guests, for your interest and also for the discussion. And thanks also to the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy and the Vienna School for International Studies for hosting this event. Thank you. And there is still further possibility to exchange next doors. Okay.